Thank you. Firstly, I'd just like to say how pleased I am to be here today. In particular, I'd like to thank Joe and the organising committee for the invitation to speak. And thank you, Carol, for the introduction. I'm hoping that you're a generous audience this evening. I've sacrificed playing the first round of the Junior C Wicklow Football Championship this evening. It's probably the second half now, so hopefully you're nice, and I feel it's worth it. So I'm going to talk about the National Planning Framework and some of whether I think in its current formulation it's a good idea or not, or rather should it have been slightly different. I'm of the view maybe it should have been slightly different, but I'll talk you through as we go along the slides. Sorry, just need to grab the clicker. So I'm going to talk firstly about the role of the National Planning Framework, explore the motivation behind it, why it was designed as it is, consider some of the regional policy-related research. If you look like you're getting a bit sleepy, I might move on quickly, so I'll keep looking up at you. And then reflect on its implementation. Do I think it can actually work? Or do I think it can be implemented or work? So the principle of the National Planning Framework is to guide good planning and investment decisions over the next 25 years. And I think most people agree that it's a welcome initiative. Given that the national population is forecast to rise by about 1 million people and generate an estimated 2/3 additional jobs, it's important that planned investment is coordinated with the location of population and economic activity. We need to match them up. During the consultation phase of the NPF and in much of the commentary since its publication, the primary political concerns have related to a perceived lack of regional balance and dominance of Dublin, and also negative social and environmental impacts of sprawl. So I'm reminded of one of the arguably emotive newspaper headlines last year, how Dublin is eating Ireland, and the argument is put forward that a regional counterbalance is required. So at one of the NPF consultation events, Simon Coveney, he was then Housing Minister, he's now Taoiseach, he came to UCD, and at the time he was saying that we need to double the population of the regional cities to start to address these concerns. The final plan is slightly less ambitious for the regional cities, but nevertheless there's a strong emphasis on accelerating their growth and development. But the motivation is clear. To curtail any further relative shift in population towards the eastern seaboard and to limit further growth in Dublin's national economic dominance, the view being that we cannot let this continue unchecked. And that's a quote from the document itself. There are other policy challenges that exist. So one major political concern is regional balance. Other ones that arise from Brexit, the Trump administration, potential protectionist policies, climate policy obligations that we are likely to fail to meet most of our targets, and threats to our corporation tax with further discussions about EU integration. So the NPF is about managing our internal, or the approach to it's an internal policy action. We pursue it internally. And I suppose the proposition I would say is that we need to make sure that we don't undertake policy action internally that undermines our national potential. The NP and national well-being. The National Planning Framework, it refers to prosperity and happiness. So that's the measures it refers to. So if it is assumed that regional policy seeks to alter the natural patterns of population growth and economic activity, this planning framework aspires to achieve this principally by restraining Dublin and focusing relatively more population growth in the 4 regional cities and some other selected centres than would have naturally occurred. And the aspiration is for the regional cities to develop at, and I quote, an unprecedented rate to create viable alternatives to Dublin. That's what the aspiration is. But before addressing the extent to which I believe this vision can be achieved, I think it's useful to consider whether our regional balance is at odds by comparison with international comparators abroad. So the data that's displayed, you probably can't see it very clearly, but this is from the National Planning Framework consultation briefing paper that was published last year. And it compared Ireland and Dublin to similarly populated nations, Finland, Scotland, New Zealand and Denmark. So they have broadly the same populations. And they said, well, how does our largest city stack up against their largest city? So Dublin city region population, which is greater than the city, not quite the greater Dublin area, it's more like the metropolitan area, the continuous built-up area, essentially. So 1.6 million people, 69 million people, Copenhagen 2 million, Auckland 1.42 million, Glasgow 1.79 million, Helsinki 1.47 million. And they're all around between 4 and 5 million in terms of their total population. So the argument was, these are places we can consider whether we're comparable or not. So all of these nations comprise small open economies, and on these measures, Dublin has the greatest primacy in terms of its respective percentage of national population. So it has the biggest national population share compared to the others, and the biggest national GDP share compared to all the others. The absolute size of the Dublin city region, in terms of the sheer numbers, is broadly comparable with those equivalent cities. But it is often the case that countries with a small open economy, like these, with the exception of Scotland perhaps, tend to be somewhat dominated by their largest city. So just in terms of the percentages, so Dublin is 37% of the Irish population and 48% of national GDP. Denmark, 36% population share and 43% of national GDP. Denmark is often the country that is put forward as Denmark and Finland are often ones that the government like us to be compared against. However, it is evident that the number of Irish second-tier cities and their respective size are comparatively small. So what these metrics, at the very top, it says cities greater than or equal to 500,000, and there's one in each of those nations. Cities that are greater than or equal to 200,000, one in Ireland, one in Denmark, 2, 2, and 1. Greater than or equal to 100,000 in Ireland, none. Denmark 2, New Zealand 3, Scotland 1, Finland 1. Greater than or equal to 50,000, Ireland 3, the others 6, 6, 6, and Finland 11. So the total number of cities, based on a measure of about 50,000, we have 5. Denmark 10, New Zealand at 12, Scotland 10, and Finland 18. So we have less cities. We are more rural. So in terms of the urbanisation rate, we have the lowest level of urbanisation compared to all these comparator countries that the government likes to compare us with. Well, this was their document. I added in the last few comparator numbers. So we're 62%, all the others are Denmark's 88, New Zealand 86, Scotland 81, Finland 84%. And the argument is often put forward that Dublin is a runaway train and it's growing out of kilter. There's no comparison. It grows at about just over 1% a year. Copenhagen 0.95%, Auckland 1.6%, Scotland or Glasgow 0.13%, and then Helsinki 1.12% a year, and that's over 1995 to 2015. So looking at the long run, Dublin's growth is pretty much in line with other comparable cities that we might be competing with for international investment. So the comparatively small number of second-tier cities in Ireland may be partly explained by the significantly more urbanised populations in each of the other countries, so at about an average of 85 compared to our 62. So the merits of whether to promote a more equal distribution of gains through all regions or to promote a stronger individual city are strongly argued. It's been central to the debate about whether it's a good national planning framework. Do we have the right number of centres? Should we have more? Should we have less? But what is known is that larger and more densely developed cities provide more urban agglomerative effects. Essentially, they provide larger and more diversely skilled labour pool, reduced costs of doing business and higher productivity levels. In essence, industry can earn more in core cities than they can in peripheral areas. A recent debate between leading British academics from Manchester and others in London concerning the primacy of London in the United Kingdom relative to the principal northern cities in England provides a good example of some of the regional policy related arguments that we have here. So we talk about Dublin versus this Atlantic corridor of our other cities and on the west, essentially. The argument in the UK, from Manchester's perspective, with a population approaching 3 million in Greater Manchester, is that it needs to be larger to compete with London. and disproportionate investment goes into London and not into the northern cities. It's of a different scale, but London is the type of city that Dublin is more likely, or Manchester is more likely to be the type of city that Dublin is competing with rather than London, really. So London's counter-argument is that maximising potential of regional cities requires consideration of more diverse policy mix than infrastructure investment alone. A more selective approach is required, in their view, rather than spreading the jam too thinly. Sorry, I skipped one. So, in terms of an economy like Ireland that has exhibited what we'd call core and periphery patterns of development historically, the following are worth noting. When you increase investment in transport, there's bigger returns to be made in a single hub where all the networks meet. You get more returns from that investment than if you have single lines running around the place. Increasing access to peripheral regions can actually, in some instances, be to their disadvantage if the market benefits are captured by the dominant city. So if it's just extending its capture into the surrounding countryside, you may think you're increasing connectivity, but you may be losing some of the market potential that would have otherwise been local. Path dependence is also a key factor. So cities establish themselves and their development patterns can be difficult to alter. Trade policy and urban structure can also be connected. The potential emergence of dominant cores is most related to countries with a small population and an open economy, or developing countries or closed economies, but I think the top one is of more interest, and I'll get back to that in a second. And then centralisation rather than devolution of power also tend to result in a dominant core. On the other hand, cities can generate negative effects, so congestion, pollution. And the more costly these are, the more likely that you start to promote dispersal. So the question really is, looking at the status quo, Dublin's dominance is really reinforced by a lot of these factors. So I gave you this is what the literature generally says, the academic research. So this is comparing Dublin with those features. So in terms of what might we call path dependence, Dublin is a European city and formerly the second city in the then British Empire. It has an historic advantage. It's very difficult to displace. Ireland has a relatively small population with an open economy. Countries with small populations and an open economy tend to become dominated by a single city. We have a relatively centralised governance with little devolved power to the local authority level, and we've been stripping many of the functions away from our local authorities and abolishing many of them as well in the last number of years. So we have now Irish Water, National Transport Transport Authority and Transport Infrastructure Ireland. Waste is privatised. We've a range of housing agencies rather than having very localised delivery. We've on board Penala the recent decision to, rather than bring planning applications for reasonably significant housing developments to the local authority, you now can go directly to the board. So all these centralised agencies rather than the local authority having a significant function. And then finally, abolition of 80 town and borough councils and 2 city councils. So we merged 2 city and county councils. So we've abolished a lot of what would have been local empowerment. And the result of that is most of the power is centralised in civil servants and a smaller number of local authorities. And we developed a radial transport system with Dublin as a national and international hub. So all these things simply reinforce the dominance of Dublin. And that's before you consider demographics. So Eurostat tells us Dublin has the highest crude birth rate in Europe of any major city, and Fingal and South Dublin counties have the highest rates of any of the Irish counties, highest crude birth rate. So with Dublin having a population growth rate of about 1% a year, the CSO predicts that its share of the national population will continue to grow. So the question is really, will this new plan change anything? Will it break that dominance? Can it break that dominance? Should it break that dominance? So most underlying trends seem to be at odds with any significant loss of primacy. Yet the aspiration is to develop the regional cities at an unprecedented rate. So this will require a significant change in the existing population and spatial trends, whereas the primary objective of the predecessor to this document, the National Spatial Strategy, was to focus development in 23 gateways and hubs. I think we're now down to about 10 centres. The aggregate population share of the gateways and hubs actually declined since 2002. So the places that were aspired to be promoted, their share of the population declined. Dublin was the only place to realise its population targets from the last plan. So it's very difficult to alter long-term development patterns. If you really want to make a difference, you have to do something very significant. So it really requires a significant and coordinated disruptive intervention. And my argument is really we have chosen too many centres, again, for anything disruptive to happen. We're spreading the jam too thinly. We're investing in too many places for the existing pattern to be altered and for any other city to gain a significant foothold and gain in any way an international profile. So there are also other risk factors. So apart from the fact that the trends are against Dublin really being displaced, there's also other risk factors. And these have come up in a recently published National Risk Assessment and also the National Competitiveness Council scorecard. So lack of skilled labour supply in construction. We are under the average EU rate of producing graduates in the construction-related areas. There's large-scale opposition in many instances to large infrastructure projects. So think of the new water pipeline, any wind farm proposition. And there are serious housing and infrastructure capacity constraints as a result. So the alternative approach, so I would argue it's not overpopulation that's increasing the pressures that Dublin faces, whether it's in housing or infrastructure. I would argue it's long-standing underinvestment in the capital, the result being a city with the 5th highest cost of living among EU capitals and a low proportion of Dublin's population with access to a high-frequency public transport service. So it's about 38%. Stockholm would be at 71%, Brussels 84%. Most cities have better transport, high-frequency and high-capacity transport services than Dublin would, comparable cities. So consequently, the functional capacity of Dublin's transport system is declining. We're living off historic investments. And the implication of the plan to push population growth or to attempt to push population growth and economic activity away from Dublin may damage our only city of international scale, with no evidence provided that the same national benefits can be captured elsewhere within the country. And the national and long-term implications of this require serious evaluation, which I don't believe has yet been presented. So rather than articulating preferences for national population redistribution, I argue that we should be focused on promoting more desirable patterns of urban development and to limit sprawl. However, addressing the political desire to strengthen the urban structure outside of Dublin, so if we accept that Dublin is going to continue to grow, the real question is what should we do in the rest of the country? And the hard choice is between facilitating development in rural areas or in strategic urban development, and that's a serious challenge. The one example I'll give is if we doubled the population of County Donegal, it would become the 3rd most populous county in the country. The population of Letterkenny, if we maintain the current distribution of development and population pattern as it is today, the population of Letterkenny would be 40,000. It still doesn't register as a very significant town in the national scale because it's a predominantly rural county. So if you want to have significant urban services, something different, a different pattern is required. But I'm not sure that there's a big buy-in to that at this point. So to achieve an alternative city of scale outside of Dublin, I think we'll take a different type of national plan, one focused on building up a single other regional location where spillover benefits can be maximised and result in more effective regional development. So this is my last slide. And rather than appearing to be overly critical of the entire initiative, there are other advances that I want to highlight that I believe are positive. So firstly, the focus on compact urban development will hopefully assist in arresting excessive sprawl that has emerged over recent decades. I think that's an important focus. The other one that I think is worth a mention is the explicit reference to the bioeconomy, which sounds like a woolly word, but it encompasses the production of renewable biological resources and their conversion into food, feed, bio-based products. So it's about bringing biotechnology into our natural national resource base. And all of these sectors have a regional presence beyond Dublin, essentially. That's where their presence is predominantly located. So a key principle is that it shifts away from a fossil fuel-based economy to one that is biologically based, and seeing a new resource potential linked with new technology. I'm involved in a big research project in UCD that's related to that, but it's a potential emerging alternative for rural development. It's a new area that the government is now promoting. So just to sum up, the likely effect of the planning framework in its current form is that Dublin continues to grow at much the same rate, but with money diverted away from infrastructural investment to maintain its international competitiveness, that could potentially be damaged. And no other city will get ahead. And I think that's the bottom line. Thank you.